In the depths of the 13th century, where dogma eclipsed discovery, one English friar dared to suggest that the secrets of the universe could not be found merely in ancient texts, but through the evidence of the eye. He was Roger Bacon, the man who saw the future. Born around 1214 in Ilchester, Somerset, Bacon entered a world governed by superstition. Yet his mind was forged in the fires of curiosity, driven by a wealthy family's resources until the turbulent reign of Henry III stripped them of their fortune. At Oxford, he fell under the influence of Robert Grosseteste, a bishop who championed mathematics as the language of nature. Here, Bacon learned that geometry was not just abstract shapes, but the underlying structure of light itself. While his contemporaries were content quoting Aristotle, Bacon demanded scientia experimentalis. He argued that reasoning draws a conclusion, but does not remove doubt. Only the experiment can provide certainty. His radicalism took him to the University of Paris, a place of intellectual combat. But Bacon was abrasive, criticizing the celebrated scholars of his day for their ignorance of Greek and Arabic, alienating the very peers he needed. Around 1257, seeking resources or perhaps protection, he donned the gray habit of the Franciscan order. It was a double-edged sword. He gained a spiritual home, but lost his intellectual autonomy to a hierarchy that feared his secular curiosities. His greatest obsession was optics. Bacon dissected the anatomy of the eye and the properties of light, correctly describing the laws of reflection and refraction long before Snell or Newton, laying the groundwork for the telescope. He looked east as well, transcribing the recipe for black powder. In an anagram within his text, he hid the formula for gunpowder, charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter, foreseeing its destructive potential. Silence was imposed upon him by his order until a secret mandate arrived from Pope Clement IV. The Pope, bypassing the Franciscan censorship, commanded Bacon to write down his secret knowledge. In a frenzy of productivity, Bacon wrote the Opus Majus in just over a year. It was an encyclopedia of science, grammar, logic, and mathematics, a plea to the Church to embrace science as a weapon of faith. Within these pages, he was a visionary. He predicted self-propelling vehicles, flying machines where a man sits in the middle turning some engine, and devices to walk on the bottom of the sea. But fate was cruel. Just as the Opus Majus reached Rome, Pope Clement IV died. Bacon lost his protector, and his magnum opus lay unread by the one man who could have legitimized his work. Retribution was swift. Jerome of Ascoli, the Minister General of the Franciscans, condemned Bacon's work as suspect. The friar was placed under house arrest, his voice silenced by the very institution he sought to enlighten. Yet, ideas are harder to imprison than men. His work survived in the shadows, influencing the geography of Columbus and the astronomy of Galileo. He was the spark that smoldered for centuries before the scientific revolution caught fire. Known to history as Doctor Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher, Roger Bacon was the bridge between the medieval and the modern. He showed us that to see the truth, one must first learn how to look. By the 1240s, the mist-shrouded spires of Oxford could no longer contain Roger Bacon's voracious appetite for universal knowledge. He turned his gaze across the English Channel, leaving the familiar halls of Robert Grosseteste to journey toward the University of Paris, the chaotic, beating heart of medieval Christendom's intellectual life. Paris was a sensory overload, a cacophony of nations and dialects crowded into the left bank. Unlike the structured calm of England, this was a city where riots between students and townspeople were common, and where the intellectual stakes were lethally high. Bacon arrived during a period of fierce theological turbulence. The works of Aristotle on natural philosophy, recently reintroduced from Arabic translations, were viewed with deep suspicion, having been banned from the curriculum only decades prior due to their conflict with Christian dogma. Despite the bans, Bacon plunged into the Faculty of Arts, quickly gaining a reputation as a lecturer who dared to embrace the new logic. He lectured not on abstract theology, but on the physics of the natural world, becoming one of the first to lecture on Aristotle's forbidden metaphysics in Paris. It was here he likely encountered Peter Peregrinus, the master of experiments. Unlike the armchair theologians, Peregrinus was a man of war and mechanics. He taught Bacon that truth was not found in the dusty commentaries of the ancients, but in the manipulation of matter itself. This encounter crystallized Bacon's growing disillusionment with the scholastic method. He began to despise the endless circular debates of Paris, famously declaring that the prevailing scholars of his time would sooner debate the nature of a horse's teeth than open its mouth to count them. His disdain extended to the celebrated intellectual giants of the era, Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. To Bacon, their encyclopedic summas were built on faulty translations and a lack of mathematical rigor, mere castles of sand constructed without the foundation of empirical proof. Bacon's salvation from academic boredom came through the discovery of Alhazen, the Arab polymath. In the translation of the Book of Optics, Bacon found a mathematical language of light, geometry applied to vision, which he believed was the key to understanding God's divine illumination. Around 1257, perhaps seeking financial stability for his experiments or protection from his detractors, Bacon made a fateful decision. He donned the gray habit of the Franciscan order. It was a move that would grant him a spiritual home, but cost him his intellectual freedom. The Franciscans, under the leadership of Bonaventure, were pivoting towards mysticism and away from natural science. Bacon's obsession with astrology, alchemy, and optics was viewed not as brilliance, but as a dangerous flirtation with the necromantic arts. Confined by the strict censorship of his order, which forbade publishing without permission, Bacon was effectively silenced. He was forced to conduct his studies in secret, his laboratory becoming a cell where he drafted the concepts that would eventually become the Opus Majus. In these years of confinement, he formulated his doctrine of the four causes of error: submission to unworthy authority, influence of custom, popular prejudice, and concealment of ignorance with a display of apparent wisdom. It was a direct attack on the establishment. His struggle was not just ideological, but material. Empirical science required lenses, astrolabes, and chemicals. As a friar with a vow of poverty, Bacon had no money, leading to desperate pleas to wealthy patrons that often went unanswered. Yet, in the darkness of his Parisian confinement, the spark of Scientia Experimentalis was ignited. He began to define a method distinct from magic, one where observation, hypothesis, and verification were the only path to certainty. Bacon realized his only hope for validation lay beyond his order's superiors. He set his sights on the highest power in Christendom, the Pope himself, a gamble that would lead to his magnum opus, but also to his greatest peril. Paris, 1266. The Franciscan order, under the strict governance of Bonaventure, has imposed a gag order on Roger Bacon. For a man whose mind burned with the need to communicate the secrets of the universe, this enforced silence was a living death. He is forbidden from publishing his works without specific permission, effectively quarantining his dangerous ideas. But a lifeline appears from the highest echelon of Christendom. Cardinal Guy de Fawkes, an old acquaintance who had ascended to the papacy as Pope Clement IV, sends a secret mandate. He demands to see Bacon's writings, the very works his order has suppressed, commanding him to send them despite any prohibitions from his superiors. This creates a perilous paradox. To obey the Pope is to defy his immediate Franciscan masters. Bacon must work in absolute secrecy. He has no budget, no scribes, and no official support. He is forced to beg his family in England for funds to purchase the immense amount of parchment required for his magnum opus. In a frenzy of intellectual desperation, Bacon begins the Opus Majus. This was not merely a book, it was a plea for the reform of medieval education. He writes with the speed of a man possessed, knowing that the Pope's patronage is his only shield against imprisonment for heresy. The Opus Majus is divided into 7 parts, beginning with the causes of error. Bacon boldly attacks the blind reliance on authority, custom, and the opinions of the unlearned crowd. He argues that humility and skepticism are the true gateways to wisdom, a radical stance in an era dominated by Aristotle's unquestioned dogma. He moves to philology, asserting that true theology requires fluency in Hebrew, Greek, and Arabic. Bacon realized that mistranslations of the Bible and Aristotle were corrupting knowledge at its source. He championed a return to original texts, bypassing the errors of centuries of intermediaries. Then the pivotal assertion, mathematics is the gate and key to the sciences. In the Opus Majus, Bacon argues that nothing in nature can be understood without geometry and numbers. He links the divine order of the cosmos directly to mathematical laws, elevating the subject from a mere trade skill to a divine language. The section on optics, or perspectiva, is his masterpiece within the masterpiece. Drawing on the works of Alhazen, Bacon details the anatomy of the eye and the refraction of light. He predicts the telescope and microscope, describing how lenses can make distant objects appear near and small objects appear large. Perhaps most revolutionary is his section on Scientia Experimentalis. Bacon diverges from the scholastic method of endless debate. He declares that reasoning draws a conclusion but does not remove doubt. Only the experiment creates certainty. He is drafting the blueprint for the modern scientific method. Realizing the Opus Majus might be lost or too dense, Bacon frantically writes two summaries, the Opus Minus and the Opus Tertium. These were his backup plans, lighter versions intended to ensure the Pope grasped the urgency of his proposals, even if the main text failed to arrive. The manuscript is finished in 1267. It is a colossus of 840 pages, but Bacon cannot deliver it himself. He entrusts this treasure to his favorite pupil, a boy named John, who allegedly had a proficiency in optics and languages that rivaled the masters of Paris. The stakes of this delivery were absolute. If the Franciscan authorities intercepted the package, the work would be burned and Bacon imprisoned. The journey to the papal court in Viterbo was fraught with danger, carrying the only copy of a blueprint for the future of science. Tragedy strikes not on the road, but at the destination. Shortly after the manuscripts likely arrived, Pope Clement IV dies in 1268. Bacon's protector, the one man with the power to implement these reforms, is gone. The Opus Majus falls into the Vatican archives, its immediate call to action silenced by death. Without the Pope's protection, Bacon is left vulnerable. The Opus Majus, rather than saving him, becomes evidence of his novelties and suspected necromancy. The silence he fought to break descends once again, and within years, he is allegedly imprisoned by the very order he sought to enlighten. Yet the text survived. The Opus Majus sat dormant, a time bomb of knowledge that would eventually influence the likes of Columbus and Copernicus. It remains one of the most remarkable single-handed intellectual efforts in history, a medieval encyclopedia of the future written in the shadow of the Inquisition. In the Opus Majus, Roger Bacon dedicates a massive section to perspectiva, the study of optics. For Bacon, light was not merely physical, it was the fundamental agency of all divine creation. He did not work in isolation. Bacon acted as the primary conduit for the optical treasures of the Islamic Golden Age, heavily synthesizing the works of Ibn al-Haytham, known to the West as Alhazen. Rejecting the ancient notion that the eye emits beams to touch objects, Bacon confirmed that light enters the eye using rigorous geometry. He treated light rays as physical lines intersecting in space. He dissected the anatomy of the eye with unprecedented precision for a European, identifying the cornea, the lens, and the retina, viewing the eye as a complex optical instrument designed by God. But his true genius lay in refraction. Bacon observed how light bends when passing from air to water or glass. He didn't just guess, he measured the angles empirically. This understanding led to the burning glass. He demonstrated that a convex lens could concentrate solar rays to a single point hot enough to ignite wood, a feat of natural magic. Practicality drove his theory. Bacon is credited with the first scientific description of corrective lenses, noting that a segment of a glass sphere could make small letters appear large, a salvation for the aged scholar. He turned his analytical gaze to the heavens, calculating the maximum elevation of the rainbow. He correctly theorized that each raindrop acts as a mirror and a prism, reflecting and refracting sunlight. Bacon was obsessed with mirrors. He analyzed parabolic, concave, and convex reflections, dreaming of mirrors that could burn enemy ships at vast distances, blurring the line between physics and warfare. Centuries before Galileo, Bacon wrote, "We may cause the sun, moon, and stars in appearance to descend here below." He theoretically described the telescope, understanding that combining lenses could collapse distance. Conversely, he predicted the microscope, claiming that one might see a grain of sand as big as a mountain. He foresaw a world where the invisible realm would be laid bare by optics. Perhaps most startling was his intuition on the speed of light. Contra Aristotle, Bacon argued light has a finite velocity, taking time to travel, though too fast for human perception to catch. For Bacon, this was theology. Influenced by his mentor, Robert Grosseteste, he believed light was the first form of corporeal matter, the physical manifestation of divine grace spreading through the universe. His Opus Majus sat in the Pope's archives, largely unread for generations. Yet his optical diagrams were eventually plagiarized and circulated, forming the bedrock for Kepler and Descartes 300 years later. Roger Bacon didn't just look at the world, he looked through it. By mastering light, he handed humanity the keys to unlock both the stars and the microscopic building blocks of life. While Bacon's work on optics illuminated the physical world, his nocturnal pursuits delved into the shadows of alchemy, blurring the lines between proto-science and the occult in the eyes of his contemporaries. To the modern mind, alchemy suggests the foolish quest for gold, but for Bacon, it was a material science, a rigorous method to purify substances and extend human life through the creation of universal elixirs. His most volatile secret, however, was hidden within the text of Epistola de Secretis Operibus, where he concealed a formula that would eventually reshape the geopolitics of the world. Bacon was the first European to record the recipe for gunpowder, hiding the ratio of ingredients within a cryptogram to prevent such dangerous knowledge from falling into the hands of the ignorant. The decoded mixture, 7 parts saltpeter, 5 parts young hazelwood charcoal, and 5 parts sulfur, created a chemical reaction unlike anything known in Christendom. He described the effects with terrifying accuracy, a flash like lightning and a roar like thunder, capable of destroying entire armies if properly contained and ignited. While Bacon likely viewed this as a curiosity or a noisemaker for children, the military implications fueled rumors that he was trafficking with demonic forces to harness hellfire. These experiments birthed the black magic myths, transforming Bacon in the public imagination from a scholar into a necromancer, a reputation solidified by the legend of the Brazen Head. The legend claims Bacon spent 7 years constructing a mechanical head of brass, bound by spirits, intended to speak all the wisdom of the world and build a wall of brass around England. According to the myth, exhaustion overcame Bacon, and while he slept, the head spoke 3 cryptic phrases: "Time is," "Time was," and "Time is past," before shattering into pieces. While the Brazen Head was folklore, the danger Bacon faced was real. His criticism of the clergy and his suspected novelties drew the ire of Jerome of Ascoli, the minister general of the Franciscan order. In 1277, the condemnation of magical arts swept through Paris. Bacon's insistence on the utility of astrology and alchemy was no longer viewed as scientific inquiry, but as heresy. Bacon was allegedly imprisoned or placed under strict house arrest for over a decade, his voice silenced, not by the failure of his science, but by the fear it inspired in the dogmatic. He vehemently defended his work in Epistola de Nullitate Magiae, arguing that true magic was merely the application of natural laws not yet understood by the common man. Roger Bacon died around 1292, leaving a legacy trapped between the title of Doctor Mirabilis and the caricature of a sorcerer, a pioneer who saw the Gunpowder Age centuries before it dawned. History would come to know him as Doctor Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher. Yet Roger Bacon died in relative obscurity around 1292. For centuries, his intellectual corpse was buried under the weight of ecclesiastical censorship and the Aristotelian dogma he fought so vigorously to dismantle. Immediately following his death, the Franciscan order purportedly nailed his manuscripts to the shelves of their library, allowing them to rot, a symbolic imprisonment of his dangerous ideas. The suppression was so effective that for 200 years, Bacon was remembered more as a necromancer than a scientist. It was not until the English Renaissance that his reputation began to shift. Mathematicians like John Dee salvaged Bacon's works, recognizing that the friar's obsession with optics and mathematics was not sorcery, but the foundational grammar of the physical universe. Bacon's Opus Majus, finally printed in the 18th century, revealed a startling truth. He had articulated the cycle of observation, hypothesis, and experimentation centuries before Francis Bacon, to whom the scientific method is usually credited. His legacy in optics is tangible on the faces of billions today. By analyzing the geometry of convex lenses, Bacon provided the theoretical framework that would eventually lead to the invention of spectacles in Italy shortly after his time. Beyond vision correction, his treatises on the refraction of light through crystals anticipated the telescope and microscope. He famously claimed that with proper lenses, one could make distant objects appear near, a concept Galileo would actualize nearly 400 years later. Bacon also left a volatile inheritance. He was the first European to record the precise chemical formula for gunpowder. While he viewed it as a curiosity, his detailed recipe changed the geopolitical landscape of the West forever, ending the Age of the Night. His intellect pierced the veil of time itself. Bacon petitioned Pope Clement IV to correct the Julian calendar, calculating a significant error in the solar year. The Church ignored him then, only to implement corrections almost identical to his proposals 3 centuries later in the Gregorian Reform. However, the popular imagination trapped him in legend. For nearly half a millennium, he was the protagonist of The Famous History of Friar Bacon, a fictional narrative featuring a talking brazen head, reducing a brilliant empiricist to a mere stage magician. Cryptographers and historians still debate his connection to the Voynich manuscript. While unproven, the association highlights Bacon's known expertise in ciphers and his belief that powerful knowledge must be encoded to protect it from the unworthy. In his letter, De Secretis Operobis, Bacon predicted the future of engineering with eerie accuracy: horseless carriages, flying machines, and ships that move without rowers. He saw the potential of technology to master nature long before the Industrial Revolution. The 19th and 20th centuries finally rehabilitated him. Historians of science stripped away the alchemy myths to reveal a thinker who argued that authority and custom were the enemies of truth, a thoroughly modern stance in a feudal world. Today, a statue of Bacon stands in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. He is no longer the sorcerer, but the patron saint of the experimental method, holding an astrolabe, forever measuring the world he sought to understand. His true legacy is the courage to question. In an era where answers were dictated by scripture or ancient Greek texts, Bacon dared to ask the universe directly, demanding proof through experience rather than argument. Roger Bacon was a man out of time, a lighthouse whose beam was too bright for his contemporaries to navigate by. He planted the seeds of the modern world in the soil of the Middle Ages, waiting for history to catch up.